I am thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Marian Ryan, who is the Middlesex County District Attorney. I'm sure many of you know her. DA Ryan represents what is the Commonwealth's largest county with 54 towns and cities and 21 colleges. In urban, suburban, and rural areas, it comprises over 1/4 of the population of Massachusetts. She's a career prosecutor with significant courtroom experience, having prosecuted many of Middlesex County's most challenging cases. She's been a leader in domestic violence prevention and prosecution throughout her career and has conducted trainings across the country for prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and service providers in recognizing the signs of domestic violence. She also regularly leads lectures and workshops on workplace safety, and today she's going to talk to us about active shooter training.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you so much for having me today, and I also want to thank you and your organizations for being here. As you heard a little bit about Middlesex County, and I know you've talked today about a lot of different kind of crises that can arise at the workplace. Certainly for me as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer in Middlesex County, the most pressing issue is the kind of situation, the active shooter that occurs with stunning frequency. And what is always interesting to me is if you think back 20 years to when Columbine happened, you think about the coverage, seems to be wall-to-wall coverage, the conversations, everything that happened. Think about some of the other incidents we've seen happen, whether it was at the Discovery Channel, at the Anheuser-Busch factory. We've gotten to a place where they don't get that kind of coverage. And in contrast to Columbine, we now have over one school shooting a week in the United States. And if you're looking to check and find out about it, where you will find it in the Boston Globe is on the bottom of page 2 in the little news notes. That's where you will see 3 people died at a school, 4 people died at a company, because it has become so commonplace. And in preparing for it and talking about, do you do training, what kind of training, if you do a workplace training using one of the trainings that are available, does that protect you? Are you ready? What else should you be thinking about? I want to begin by talking a little bit about what it is that helps you, first of all, to avoid getting to the active shooter situation. That's where we want to be, right? It's great to know what to do when it's happening. It would be better if it didn't happen. And if it does happen, how do you minimize the damage? How do you prevent the escalation in scale? Because the awful thing that we've learned is when you see these incidents, it is extraordinarily rare that there has not been some red flag that people saw. It's not even that they missed the red flag. They usually saw the red flag. They either discounted the red flag or they kept the red flag to themselves, and 4 people in the organization each had a red flag and no one knew that the other knew about that red flag. Or, and I find we have had very clear examples of this across our county, organizations have invested a lot of money in preparing. They think they are ready. Well, when you think you are ready, it would be a good idea to have a policy that people can access immediately, because I would venture to guess that if the folks in this room are like everyone else, you have lots of policies that are 25 pages long, and they are in the bottom drawer of your desk. And if a situation broke out in the hallway, it would take you a little bit to go back, pull that policy out, and figure out what to do next. If you've invested in equipment and technology that you think will help you to be prepared, it's important that you've tried that out. And I know that sounds like who would not do that? We have had numerous examples of people who thought they were ready in inventorying their own organization, thought we bought this, we did this. Something happened, and we had never figured out exactly how that was going to work. And we didn't know what personnel, and I'll give you some more specific examples, but we didn't know who was going to be responsible for that. But let's start by thinking about what we do know about these incidents is that they fall into one of four categories. Right? The first is the one that we are probably best prepared for. That is when you have an individual with criminal intent who comes into your organization to do harm. Right? That's the bank robber. That's the person who comes in to commit a crime. Old-fashioned kind of incident. We're probably best prepared for that. We've bought surveillance cameras. We've got a policy if people handle money, of what they turn over. We have buttons and alarms that we will press. We have code cards for the doors. We have fingerprint identification to get into places. So we're probably pretty well prepared for a lot of those. Second, and more dangerous and now more common, is you have a patient, a client, who has a reason to be in your organization. They have been admitted. This is what happens when we've had the hospital shootings, right? That person is there as a patient. They've been a patient from before. They're allowed to come in. And now they are afforded a certain level of access, and they are able to do great harm. They are also often a greater harm because in their previous visits, they've been able to acquire information about how your organization works. So contrast, keeping those two in mind, because I think those are easier to understand. In Middlesex County, we've obviously seen, tragically, a number of examples of these. But think about the first, the stranger who comes in. Those individuals often are experienced in what they are going to do, and they are taking advantage of vulnerabilities that you hopefully have evaluated before an event arises. In December of 2010, on the day after Christmas, 3 individuals executed a meticulously planned robbery of the Kohl's department store in Woburn. During that robbery, officers responded, and an officer was shot and killed in that response. The individuals conducting that robbery were experienced at what's known as the smash and grab kind of robbery, going in, going to a jewelry counter. All they were interested in taking, that was all they removed from the store. They took advantage of vulnerabilities, 2 of which are things that you can be thinking about. First of all, it was the day after Christmas. Right? There were not a lot of people at work. A lot of the people who were at work were in roles that were different than what they usually had. So everybody who had the ability to take the day off was off. The folks that were working were covering lots of different things. One of the complicating factors that lengthened that incident was there were individuals who did not have the codes for the safes and the storage for the jewelry. So when the robbers were demanding it, they legitimately did not know. They hadn't worked in that area before. Right? It caused the incident to last much longer and probably in some way contributed to some of the damage that was done. The second vulnerability, which living here we don't always think about, was the weather. We later recovered texts and other communications that showed that the criminals planning that activity planned to do it during a snowstorm. Why? Because in every organization, when you have panic buttons or alerts for the police, when you're being robbed, they are set to go off at a certain delay. because the hope is that the perpetrators will have fled before the police get there. And that will lessen the risk of what happened here, which was literally a shootout in the parking lot. Their belief was that that delay, coupled with the snowstorm, where police would be busy responding to accidents, it was essentially a blizzard that night, police would be busy responding to out traffic lights and helping with traffic and doing all kinds of things, would be even further delayed, allowing them to escape even further. Unfortunately, and tragically for the officer who lost his life, that officer should not have been the responding officer. He had had a flat tire, happened to have stopped at a gas station down the street to get his tire replaced, and they were just finishing and getting his cruiser ready. So he responded much, much more swiftly than anybody could have expected, because he was just steps down the road and got there very quickly. The same thing happened exactly 9 months later, again in Woburn, where, again, experienced perpetrators were effecting the robbery of a jewelry store. An officer, again, responded much more quickly because he happened to be working at a funeral around the corner from the store. Those individuals had taken advantage of the fact that it was the first day of school to commit that robbery. First day of school, everybody's out, right? Lots of traffic, the school buses are out there. Traffic is just slow everywhere. They counted on the delay plus the traffic, keeping the police away long enough for them to finish the crime. Unfortunately, the officer was at a church around the corner and was there in seconds. Both of those incidents also focus on something you should think about, which is the physical location of your own building. Right? Both of those establishments were targeted in part because they were located very close to the on-off highway ramp. Very easy to commit the crime, disappear onto Route 95, right? Making it virtually impossible once you've got a 5 or 6 minute lead to find those individuals, or to follow those individuals. So there are vulnerabilities that get exploited by that. There's also in both of those instances, we were able to recover video footage and other evidence that showed that the individuals who committed those crimes had been in those establishments in the days and weeks before. Right? So again, in thinking about red flags, think about who's around your business who shouldn't be there. When do you see a car in a parking lot late at night? Do you know who that is? Do you see the same people come into an establishment seemingly lost, looking for directions, walking about? Because that's what happened in both of those situations. But also illustrating the way in which people who have legitimate access, thinking about the second category, the people who have legitimate access. Many of you might remember one of the first really crisis situations in a workplace that took place in Middlesex County, and that was in January of 2000. We had a young woman who had been working for a number of years as a waitress at a pancake house. There was a gentleman who came to the pancake house virtually every day to eat. And at some point, he had become romantically interested in this waitress. That interest was not at all reciprocated. But he continued to come in and would always find his way to a seat in her area. Very generous in tipping, seemed to be a nice, lonely guy. A lot of interaction with the staff, got to be friendly with lots of people in the staff. Always available to kind of help out a little bit. If he was there and they were closing and it snowed, he was happy to help the women who worked there clear their cars off. If they seemed to be short and there was a lot of trash that needed to go out, happy to help, kind of learned the path through the kitchen, out to the dumpsters. Went on for months. And at some point, his presence so often and insisting on sitting with this one waitress was enough of a concern that she started to express that to the management. So they started redirecting him. When he came in, they'd seat him somewhere else. He would behave oddly, in retrospect, sitting and staring across, asked a lot of questions about who was working when, how long they were working. And then things happened that should have been and eventually became red flags. When she was the manager and was closing, several times she left, found a flat tire or a car that wouldn't start. Who would appear driving by and come into the parking lot and help? The first time that happens, it's a coincidence. After that, it's a pattern. It is a pattern that you see very often. And when she would come to work the next day, she would mention, and it got increasingly strange, went out last night, car wouldn't start, defendant came by, helped me drive over to the gas station. So lots of managers know that something is going on, know that she's worried about it, don't all know that they each have pieces of what's happening. When the things like the disabled car continued, when she started leaving work and finding flowers on the hood of her car, right? At that time, that kind of behavior, for instance, leaving a flower, which is not threatening or harassing, did not give someone the opportunity to get a restraining order because somebody just left a rose on her windshield. Again, lots of people across the organization knew that something was going on. No one knew all of what was happening. She made efforts as things got worse to protect herself. Went to court, was told she didn't qualify for a restraining order. At some point, there was something said that actually qualified for a threat. He was prosecuted for threats. Placed on probation. Behavior continued. Ultimately, after about 8 months of that behavior and opportunities for information to flow around, attempts to protect herself the best that she could with the existing law, she returned home from work one day to the two-family house that she lived in Everett and found an Amazon package outside, leaning against her door, addressed to her. She picked the package up, carried it upstairs. When she set it down on the kitchen counter, the setting down on the counter was sufficient to detonate the bomb inside. She was killed as a result of that bomb going off. Because of that loss, because of the inability of the law at that time to adequately protect her, she was one of multiple siblings. Her siblings pledged that they would make a difference, and they were the leading voice behind the passage of the harassment law, which, number one, allowed people to get an order against someone that they were not related to or in a romantic relationship with, and also qualified conduct that did not itself have to be criminal or threatening, but could be viewed as harassing under the circumstances. For example, the flowers. Because placing a flower is not threatening or harassing in and of itself, threatening in and of itself, or violent, it didn't qualify under the old order. But getting a flower on your windshield 4 days a week from somebody you don't want to have anything to do with, that is harassment. That is something we can now prosecute. But he took advantage of what he learned by being that customer. He knew the ways she would get out. If she saw him outside and tried to avoid him by going out the back door, he knew to pull around and see that her car was outside the back door. So there's all of the things that you're thinking about that are different there than when you are preparing for that stranger. And probably the one that is most common and least anticipated is, think about, I'm sure that everybody in this room has had the experience of going somewhere. You may have a perfect right to be there. You're not familiar with the place, especially if you have your arms full. People hold doors for you all the time. They've kind of seen you. I've sort of seen you in the elevator. Those kinds of access are granted to people who previously have had an opportunity to legitimately be on the premises. Organizations will say, we absolutely have a card access. I would guarantee you that this afternoon you could walk in with your arms full, especially if you are well-dressed and look like you belong there, somebody will hold the door in front of you. Those systems are not helpful when you can't allow for the people that have previously had good access to the place. And again, as well, with people that you know or have seen, it's important that your employees know what you know about their own safety. You may have lots of things in place in your organization for safety. If everybody doesn't know them, it's like the policy. They are not helpful. We did one of our workplace training sessions one day with a group of folks from hospitals. And there are lots of issues with hospitals around safety. There are obviously places where people get bad news. It's a highly stressed environment. But think about some of the things that exist in that setting that you may have similar settings in your own organization that are inherently dangerous. Most people have probably had the experience of going to an ICU, intensive care. The gold standard now for an ICU is to have a nurse's station in the middle, to have rooms around it like numbers on a clock. There's one way in, so we can control who's coming in. These are the sickest patients. You usually have to ring or buzz or do something to get inside. Think about an active shooter in an ICU. There's one way in, one way out. The rooms, in order to ensure that nurses can constantly be monitoring all of the equipment that the sickest patients have, are glass. It's hard to hide in a glass room. The rooms have no access to each other because the patients are very sick. You want to have some privacy. So a person who finds themselves in a room that is glass, an active shooter standing in the middle who can see everyone, has nowhere else to go. And a shooter who comes in and positions themselves inside the door, there's no way out of that unit. We've also discovered frequently in those settings, and for many other organizations it's true as well, there are, for instance, panic buttons that are placed in institutions. We were doing a workplace training one day with a number of staff from the same hospital. And at some point, the question was raised, well, if you were in the ICU and this happened, what would you do? And someone said, I'd press the panic button. And another person who worked there said, we have a panic button? Not very useful, but think about that, right? It sounds silly. In hospitals, as in many other places, there's a lot of turnover. So when you put that in 2 years ago and you trained everybody who was there, you didn't train the people you hadn't hired. You didn't train the people who on the day after Christmas are working down there, even though they usually belong somewhere else. So how are you going to communicate that information in an effective way so that having it is accessible? Okay? I talked a little bit before about having equipment that no one has prepared for. We spent a lot of time a few years ago when we first started doing this work, talking with our 21 colleges and universities. They're sprawling campuses, different buildings, lots of people coming and going. How can we be safe? One of our colleges invested in a lot of money in what you probably have in here somewhere, so many, right there, those phones, right? The idea was, if I'm in this room and I hear something outside, everyone plans for, I would shut the doors and I would get on that phone. It's two issues people don't always think about. The first is, have you built a relationship with your local law enforcement and first responders so that when someone calls and says, if they get an outside line, I'm in room 238, well, when the police come down the street, you want them to know where 238 is. If you've remodeled your building, have you built a relationship with your police department and given them the blueprints? One of the school shootings that occurred out in the Midwest, there were 4 children who managed to crawl away, one of them having been shot, and crawl into a library. Somebody had a cell phone, they were able to call outside. Active shooter going through the halls. They were telling the police, we are in the library. The school had been renovated. The library was not where the person on the police department who went to the school thought the library was. No one had easy access to that new blueprint. Those kids waited an agonizing 9 extra minutes. 9 minutes is a really long time when people are shooting outside in the hallway. That one of the individuals, the one who'd been shot, suffered a much more serious injury than probably would have been the case. His condition became much worse because of being in there that long, because no one had any idea how to find where they were. Okay? So you have to think about the plans you develop as being put into place when there's deafening noise outside, there's smoke, there's screaming, there are people who are hurt, and there are people outside who may have very little familiarity with the facility you have. And the testing piece, to go back to the college that put in those phones, they actually had a fatal incident that occurred on campus. The person downstairs, sitting at the front desk of the building, in the plan, was dispatched to go and make access, open all the gates, to make access for the first responders that were coming. In the plan, that was also where the phone rang from the rooms upstairs. So everybody upstairs was trying to call in to say, I have 12 students in room 7. The person who was supposed to be answering the phone was outside letting the fire trucks and the police cars through the back gates. In the plan, it said phone will ring at the front desk and be answered by front desk attendant. You didn't take into account that that front desk attendant had conflicting duties. That's why it's so important, if you put something in place, you have to do a real drill. You have to figure out if it works in real time. You also have to think about the fact, and I know Judy and others talked to you a little bit about the media, that when these kind of incidents happen, even while you may still have an active shooter on the premises, there are going to be people inside the institution who have phones that are going to be tweeting out. What happens when you have an event that's being tweeted outside? The people inside, particularly if you have children, they have parents, family, everyone who's going to get frantic. They will not sit at home to watch that. They will begin converging on your institution. When we had that incident take place at the college and university, we literally could not get some of the first response vehicles in because there were so many frantic parents and media arriving and literally blocking the driveways. So that's a piece of your plan that you have to think about where are people going? Where are the people going that are coming in? Who's going to tell them to go there? And how are we going to contain, as anybody can imagine, there is nothing worse than family that is worried about the person who's inside. So you may have an active shooter still on the premises. You may have first responders, even if the threat has been alleviated, still trying to figure out where people are, how to get them out. And you may have lots of other people flooding there that you have not planned for how to deal with. So that has to be a critical part of your plan. And then to the last two kinds of incidents we see, one of which in Middlesex County, the most serious example was, again in 2000 in Wakefield. We had Michael McDermott, who worked at Edgewater Technology. Mr. McDermott, in what at first appeared in the days before we were so unfamiliar with workplace violence, to be a surprise incident, again, took advantage of the day after Christmas, when there were very few people in the building, when people were in different places, to finish bringing to his office the essentially armory of weapons that he had been stockpiling there for weeks, and open fire in that very large, very open space building. Killed 7 people, wounded dozens. Of course, as with so many of these incidents, it wasn't quite as much of a surprise when we peeled back what had been going on with Mr. McDermott. He had an ongoing dispute with HR about the fact that the IRS had garnished his paycheck, and HR was paying out the garnishment before he got his paycheck. He was also involved in a very heated argument with his car leasing company about what was soon to be the repossession of his car, and had started hiding his car, parking in places where he shouldn't have been parking. The company had a number of parking lots. They were very clearly delineated who was supposed to be where. They kept finding his car in places where it wasn't supposed to be. People found it, security found it. He always had a seemingly plausible excuse about why that day he was parked somewhere he should not have been. Again, and it is a trend that is going in the other direction in many ways, he was able to kill so many people and wound so many people, in part because of the open space concept. It was an old mill that had been refinished, lots and lots of open space and lots of glass. The kind of space that we all look at and think, this is great. Lots of light, lots of ability to see people, very fluid. He was able to take a position in the middle of that mill, see where everybody was who was working, and very systematically work his way around like a clock, shooting into the offices where people were. And again, because of the nature of the mill building, the offices had a brick wall at the back, 2 side walls and a glass wall. There was nowhere anybody was going without having to walk closer to where he was. So when you evaluate what's the safety, again, think about it if I was attempting to keep, by the use of a weapon, to keep people in certain places. Shooters are successful in those situations because they can see everybody and they can get a lot of people at once. We sometimes put ourselves in the position of designing things that exactly create greater danger. So there's important to think about that piece. And finally, and again, that case really was a good example of the kinds of things that people knew were going wrong. They knew there was the upset about HR and the garnishment. They knew there was something going on about the car. No one ever brought that information together. And an important piece about that is, even when you become aware of some of those flags, when you have in place what you should have, which is a zero tolerance policy for bad behavior, so many times, and I'm sure that most people in this situation, if you've been in a workplace for a long time, know that there are people who have their own quirks. They sometimes behave in ways that are not appropriate for the workplace. And lots of times the answer when somebody questions that is, oh, that's just Joe. Yeah, he's okay. Don't worry about that. Sometimes that goes on for years. That's what had happened with McDermott. There were explosive events, inappropriate anger responses, but he did his job and then he'd go off and it would be quiet for a while. And it just became, that's how he is. So it's incumbent on management to have that policy, to make sure that people have that information, and importantly, to be thinking about many times as a manager, your instinct when something's happening is, we need to fire that person. How many of these active shooter situations do you read recently terminated, recently suspended, on suspension? Because there is, first of all, whatever identity the person has with their job, and they lose that in the time when you terminate them. There are also the very practical things, salary, but more importantly, really right now, health insurance. Right? I have a problem at work. Someone terminates me. I have a chronically ill child. I have the health insurance. My chronically ill child not being able to get their medication is not going to put me in a better mental state. One of the most difficult pieces about preventing those situations is having a way that the person leaves your employ feeling good about how they were treated. Sometimes it costs you money. Sometimes it means paying that health insurance for 3 months, paying for something else. It is an insignificant sum of money compared to the cost just in money, never mind human suffering, of one of these incidents. It's a way of not, because when somebody you fire someone, it feels like you've gotten rid of the problem. They are now out there as somebody who is a threat to your establishment. It is much better if you can move them down the road in a fairly good frame of mind. And finally, the other piece, which is harder to concentrate on and to identify the warning flags of, but we are increasingly seeing, is you have an active shooter situation where the problem that's being acted out is one of your belongs to one of your employees and has nothing to do with work. Right? Any number of the active shooter incidents across our country have been the disgruntled boyfriend, husband, adult child. Okay? The Connecticut school, remember that was the son of the receptionist at the school? Okay? Those are difficult because you may not know about them. If you have not created a culture where people are able to talk to someone about the fact, I just got a restraining order against my husband, boyfriend. What is going to happen, what has happened in so many of those, I've worked here for a long time. You know my husband, boyfriend. We've socialized together. He comes to the front desk, says, I'm just here to pick Marian up for lunch. It's a surprise. Right? The nice receptionist waves him right on through. And now something violent happens inside. Right? We did a training at some point with one of our very large defense contractors who assured us that they had taken care of that. Their security was so tight, given the nature of their work, that could never happen. Before the second day of the session, we had the spouse of somebody show up, armful of flowers. It's our anniversary. I just wanted to leave these. Come on in. Door opened. So that's the kind of situation that you can have the best security in the world, but you just buzz them in. You just let them go to the door. Because think about this. In a situation where there is some sort of domestic violence, that victim may well have been able to relocate him or herself. They're living somewhere else. They're in a shelter. They're with their mother. They're somewhere else. So abuser may not be able to get to them from 5 at night until 5 in the morning. But where are they, where he knows? They're at work. We have a police department in our county that literally was unable to receive phone calls because they had an abusive spouse of one of their employees who just called every number at the police station all day long to harass her. All right? It does two things for the abuser. It gives them control over their victim because now they're humiliating her at work. And what's most likely to happen, right? What certainly could have happened in that situation is the chief could have said, she is my problem. I really like her, but I need to terminate her. Now she has no money. Where is she likely to go? Right back to the abuser. So it works for them. Work is a place that if I have something I want to be acting out and I can't get another forum for, I'm going to do it at work. And if you haven't built in a system of knowing those kinds of things, of having ways that people can report that, you aren't going to know about it, and you're not going to be able to respond to it. And it goes as well for thinking about the kinds of things that may be happening in a company that you need to prepare for. There may be things. You may know you're having layoffs. You're shutting some down a location. You're doing lots of things. Like everyone, you probably have people in their organization who are hanging on in their mental health status by a thread. Those kind of situations push them over the edge very often and result in the kind of incidents we keep seeing. When you take what has happened even over the last 10 years, and if you were to break down the common denominators, they are many. They are one of those 4 categories. They are things where people missed the opportunity, where bringing in someone to do the active shooter training to tell you to run or where to go or whether it's better to try to go forward or to hide or to lock the doors only works if you've created the culture to go around that gets you information, that has created a culture about how we behave in the workplace, and you have a way to effectively communicate and respond. Because there is absolutely no way to prevent one of these incidents ever happening. Your goal is to try as much as possible to do that prevention, to limit the damage that might happen, and to as quickly as possible be able to respond in an effective way to those situations. So I applaud you for being here, because just thinking about it and starting to look through a different lens at all of these issues is the first step really to being in a better position to respond. I'm happy to have joined you, and I'm happy to take questions if people have questions. Yeah.
Would you please comment on the school shootings? There's been so many, and we did start with that, but then we went into more of a corporate situation. How can we stop this from happening to our children? It's just happening way too frequently. Are you seeing common threads in those type of shootings too, the way you have with employment ones?
Yes. The most common is access to guns, obviously. You know, it is, in Massachusetts, we have very restrictive gun laws. It is not a coincidence that we are 49th in the number of gun deaths. It is not a coincidence, nor is it a guarantee, but that we have been fortunate enough not to see that kind of situation take place here. I think we have no idea of the access to guns that exist in some of these places. You know, when you peel back, and you never, usually don't see that because the incident happens, and then you start looking in the days after, and you really now, as I said, have to look to find out how these people got access to AK-15s and all of that. Those are things that we really need to be addressing, things like gun shows. Things like right now, a serious concern is 3D printers. You can right now order a 3D printer online. We have an 11-year-old who did that. You can put that 3D printer and you can create a gun. You can create a fireable gun. Okay? 11 years old, 3D printer in the basement. So there's that piece of it. And those guns are particularly dangerous, not only because they are obviously fireable and as dangerous as any other gun, but because they are created usually with some kind of plastic type material in the 3D printer. When they are fired repeatedly, they typically explode. So there's also an explosion, often of a fully loaded firearm as well. So there's the gun piece. The most significant piece, obviously, is the mental health and trauma of kids that we see. The biggest thread that we see, we have in Middlesex County 250,000 kids who go to school from kindergarten to high school every day. The most significant common thread is that we have an enormous number of kids who have suffered some kind of trauma. And not the kind of trauma that everybody thinks maybe they've been sexually assaulted or something terrible has happened. We have in Massachusetts right now 34,000 kids who are being raised by their grandparents because of drugs. Either their parents have died of an overdose or they have surrendered their children. So think about, there's 34,000 kids who for some period of time before they were surrendered were living in a situation where drug use was normalized and have now been separated from their own parents, a trauma in and of itself, and have been placed, maybe after multiple placements, in this situation with their grandparents. It is not surprising that they have suffered so much trauma. One of the most dramatic, you may have seen the article in the Globe this week, one of the most dramatic predictors is that there is a test called the Adverse Childhood Experience Test. You can go online, it's 11 questions, you can evaluate your own childhood. But it asks you, during your childhood, did these things ever happen to you? And you give yourself a certain number of points. It's sort of always, never, sometimes. And you give yourself points. A little boy who scores over a 6 on that test has a 4,800% greater chance of developing an addiction to something, and a 72% greater chance of developing a mental health issue. Certainly from kids that we come in contact, 6 would be a good day. So we've got a lot of very traumatized kids that are in big schools, often with gun access, every single day. It is not a recipe for safety. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, one more question.
Really quick, because I have another panel coming up.
Okay. So, in developing these procedures, obviously safety of the employee is most important, but then we look at from our end the risk of telling an employee, okay, this is what you do in that procedure, and it being, and in that incident, and it being wrong. So, as you were saying, it's, you know, an inevitable situation and the points to alleviate it. Does that take the risk and the liability off the employer from giving these instructions, or how do you go about developing these and implementing them in your workplace, but still, you know, in a fashion that's, you know, best procedures to handle, but in a fashion that you're not at risk for telling somebody to do the wrong procedure?
So there are really 2 questions. Will something happen and will someone sue you? Probably yes. all right? Anybody can sue anybody, really, if you have the filing fee. Will you be successfully sued? That is going to depend on the reasonableness of what you did. That's one of the reasons why it's so important to develop partnerships with law enforcement. It is not anyone, I would guess, from the backgrounds of folks here. It's not your job to figure out what's the safest thing. It is your job to have considered the safety of your employees, made partnerships with your local police departments and other agencies that can help to train you on what are best practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much.